We are joined by Kurt Volker, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. Hello, it's good to see you again.
Hello, good to be with you.
Mr. Volker, as an expert on this matter and someone who visits Ukraine regularly, do you expect that there will be a large-scale Russian offensive in May or June of this year?
I think we're already seeing attempts at a Russian offensive. They're throwing a lot of equipment and a lot of people at the front line in order to see if they can advance the territory that they occupy beyond Avdiivka, beyond Bakhmut, also in the direction of Kharkiv. It's not going very well, but I think we're going to see that continue.
Do you see a direct threat to Kyiv and Odessa? Is the possibility that Russian forces will take the Ukrainian capital becoming more likely? Russian State Duma Representative Kartopolov all but admitted that this is the objective of the Russian military.
Yes, of course the Russians want to take Kyiv, and they also want to take Odessa. They've been very clear from President Putin on down. His objective is to restore the Russian Empire and to eliminate Ukraine as a sovereign state. That's not going to succeed. That will not happen. The defenses, the air defenses in particular around Kyiv and Odessa are much stronger than they are at the front line and around Kharkiv. You also have much greater Western support for making sure that Ukraine survives as a sovereign and independent state. So I don't think Russia will achieve those objectives, but that they will certainly continue attacking.
You're saying that Western countries will do anything in their power to aid Ukraine, but at the same time, Secretary of State Blinken says that the U.S. does not approve of Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian territory. How would you respond to this statement?
I think that is a grave mistake. It is, in fact, he's accurately conveying U.S. policy. That is the U.S. policy. But I think it is a grave error. Russia is using these refineries to produce aviation fuel and other products, which are then sent to the Russian forces on the front lines who are fighting and killing Ukrainians. So these are legitimate military targets. And I think the dividing line should be not that Ukraine should not strike inside Russian territory. If Russia is using its territory for strikes against Ukraine, which it is, then it is legitimate for Ukraine to strike back. The line should be striking only military targets and not targeting civilians and the civilian infrastructure the way the Russians do. The Ukrainians should stay out of that, but they should feel it perfectly legitimate to attack military targets inside Russia.
What you're talking about also includes strikes on the Belgorod region, where not only military targets, but innocent civilians become victims of these attacks. How can that affect President Zelensky's standing?
Well, it's not being done by Ukrainians, it's being done by Russians. Presumably they get some Ukrainian support, however. I don't think that it is helpful to attack any civilian targets at all. You don't see Ukrainian bombs, Ukrainian drones hitting apartment buildings. You don't see them hitting schools. You don't see them hitting hospitals. That's the right choice. They should not be doing that. And what we've seen in Belgorod is a little concerning that it starts to blur that line.
You don't approve of Secretary of State Blinken's stance. However, do you think President Zelensky will continue to order attacks on targets inside Russia, disregarding Washington's concerns?
Yes. Well, the one part of Secretary Blinken's message that we skipped over is that he's telling Ukrainians not to do this with American-provided weapons. The Ukrainians will respect that. I have every reason to believe they will respect that, but they will do it with their own weapons. And so I think these attacks will continue on things like refineries, on bombers, on fighter aircraft, on air bases, as they have done before. As for Belgorod, again, this is something that Russian rebels, Russian insurgents are doing. They may have some Ukrainian tactical support in doing this, but it's Russian oppositionists who are doing that. It's very hard to predict what they will do in the future.
I would also like to note that State Secretary Blinken said the following: Ukraine is at a critical moment in its war with Russia and urgently needs more Western support. It is absolutely essential to get Ukrainians what they continue to need to defend themselves, particularly when it comes to munitions and air defenses. It's another reason why the supplementary budget request that the President Biden has made to Congress must be fulfilled as quickly as possible. To be frank, we hear such statements on a regular basis from the Western leaders, especially from the White House. However, let's turn to Russia and talk about how Vladimir Putin is willing to go. Mr. Volker, do you anticipate a new wave of mobilization to be announced in Russia? It is almost too convenient now after the tragedy at the Crocus City Hall in Moscow, and Vladimir Putin does seem to be in need of more manpower.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to argue that Islamist terrorist extremists from Tajikistan are somehow Ukrainian, but that is the argument that Putin seems to be making. As far as mobilization goes, there is already a plan. There's a normal period of a spring mobilization that the Russian forces do every year. I think they will use that, but then try to take advantage of this terrorist attack to press more people to sign up for the military than otherwise might have done. Frankly, I'm not sure it's going to work all that well. I know he wants to bring in 500,000 more people. I think it's going to be much lower than that. It'll probably be the normal range, perhaps of 150,000. And as the Russians are killing off 10,000 a month or more, this is really not going to plug the gap sufficiently, both in terms of numbers and in terms of making sure these people have training and equipment that they would need to be effective. So I think that everyone being pressed for joining up for the armed services in Russia will know that. And I think it will therefore dampen any enthusiasm for signing up.
Concerning the situation in Kyiv at the office of the President of Ukraine, judging from your recent experience, would you say that President Zelensky has found himself at a dead end, especially if we consider the faltering Western support and the turbulence in the American Congress?
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't think the position of Ukraine's allies is shaky. What we're finding, though, is that support for Ukraine is competing as a priority against other priorities as well. So if you look, for example, at the US Congress, 80% of the congressmen and even more, a higher percentage of the senators all support aid to Ukraine. But they disagree over other issues, such as how to handle the US border with Mexico. And that is getting in the way of getting the Ukraine aid done quickly. You may have seen that the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, gave an interview this weekend where he outlined what he sees as a pathway forward on aid to Ukraine, which they will bring up in the House next week when they return from recess. So I do think that that's going to go forward. As far as the situation inside Ukraine, this sort of delay and this deprioritization of Ukraine is affecting the public mood. But I think that will change again as we see aid approved and aid starting to flow again. And then there's a difference in Ukraine between popular attitudes toward President Zelensky. Yes, some of the enthusiasm has worn off after 2 years of war. There's a bit of war fatigue setting in. But at the same time, if you ask people, should there be any change right now? The answer is no. People want to stay with the situation they've got in order to see the war through to a conclusion. So they're not necessarily happy, but they're also not seeking change.
Mr. Volker, I simply must ask you about the mistakes that have been committed by the Ukrainian military command, according to Western experts and military commanders. For instance, it is claimed that Zelensky did not follow the West's suggestions and created too long of a front line during the now-failed counteroffensive. Now that the Ukrainian armed forces are facing new challenges, what would you say should be their main focus?
Well, first off, I think we need to discount these criticisms from experts or military figures from thousands of miles away. The Ukrainians are on the front line. They have a much better idea of what the situation actually is. They also don't have all the equipment available to them that the US forces would have if we were in battle. So it is very unfair to criticize the Ukrainians along those lines. I think they have done the best they can with what they have. So I think that we shouldn't allow generals with a 6,000-mile screwdriver to be saying that they actually know better. As far as what Ukraine's strategy should now be, they do need to solidify their defenses along this front line. They need to make sure that Russia is not able to advance any further, particularly in the direction of Kharkiv, but all over the country. And they need to prepare for more weaponry coming in. Western ammunition production is increasing, but it takes time. Western F-16s will be arriving this summer. There will be other types of equipment, we hope, as well arriving. And so they need to prepare to integrate this, to get more troops mobilized and trained, and not in a rushed way, to give a little bit of relief to the people on the front lines, and plan for this being a conflict that isn't going to go away. Putin is going to keep attacking, so Ukraine has to be preparing itself to keep withstanding that and pushing back.
Thank you for joining us today. It is always a pleasure to have you with us on TV Rain. This has been Kurt Volker, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. We talked about the challenges that Ukraine faces today, their possible resolutions, and Ukraine's warfare in Russia, which not only includes strikes on military infrastructure, but leads to civilian casualties as well.
В Украине уже к концу мая, началу июня.